Okay, so here we are this evening. We're talking about Ukraine, particularly about the negotiations that it seems that some quarters in the United States wish to force on Ukraine, with or without Ukraine's permission. So we're here with Victor Rud, an American attorney, former president of the Ukraine-US Bar Association, a very fierce and outspoken defender of Ukraine and Ukraine's rights. We also have Willy Fautré, who is the founder and president of Human Rights Without Frontiers. This is probably the best known, most influential of all of the human rights NGOs in the Brussels bubble, as we call it. And Willy, you probably one of the best known people in the EU institutions. Whenever there's any kind of human rights issues, you're very much taking the lead. There's no question about that. And I suspect that there are many politicians out there who would prefer not to cross you. Dmytro, we've known each other for a few years, the Brussels or EU correspondent for Ukrinform. You have been quite a long time actually now in Brussels, so you're probably as much of an authority as anybody on the relations between Ukraine and Europe in the context of this conflict, because this isn't a normal situation. So the relations are slightly different, or quite unique, should I say. Victor, I'd like to start with you. You sent us a very short while ago an opinion on negotiation. Really, you make it absolutely clear that you are opposed to these negotiations, which are, as I said, being forced upon Ukraine. And even there's suggestions, are there not, that the United States, and I suspect this would be under a Trump administration, I may be wrong, you perceive that they may be willing to negotiate with Russia over Ukraine's future without Ukrainian involvement.
Look, we are staying in a real world, so far as I understand, and some kind of consultations for sure are going on. If we are speaking, of course, about some kind of peace settlement in Ukraine, what I can say that there was a very strict position mentioned by the Biden administration that there could not be no talks about Ukraine, and I mean that is a very respectful point of view which should be followed. And that reflects the very important issue. Sometimes when we are speaking about some kind of international opinion, about some kind of peace plans, proposals, about Brazil, about China's proposal, and so on and so forth, sometimes we're forgetting about the crucial issue which was existing from the very beginning. And that is the Ukrainian people, because the Ukrainian people now are playing their role, irrespective of how active the West and Western countries will be in supporting Ukraine. As Ukrainian, I can say you for sure that, even if there will be the complete fatigue from the Western partners, if the society will not be willing to support Ukraine no more, the fight will not be over. It is my deep belief, because this is a fight for not only for a future. The most important is that it is a fight for freedom. And this is sometimes question of the personal freedom, Ask yourself what kind of price you'd like to pay to stay freedom. This is something that our Western partners not always understand. So our, maybe privilege that we know the both sides. We lived in the former Soviet Union times. We know for sure what so-called the Russian world bringing to the people, to ordinary people. We know for sure what this is unhuman and absolutely destructive social system. So that it is my deep belief that Ukrainians will be fighting to the end. The most problematic issue in that is that Ukrainians could end like a people. in that fight if we'll not receive proper support from the Western allies, let me say so.
Yeah.
But I'm not here to make some kind of pieces of propaganda. I'm just here to ask questions, if I may, of course.
I want to, Victor, you bluntly, you're opposed to a negotiated settlement, as far as I can tell, and I can see your position there, because we know what the Russian negotiation position always is. What's ours is what's yours is negotiable. I personally can't see Ukraine benefiting from a negotiated end. That's a terrible thing to say, because that then presupposes that it's going to be a violent end, or even more violent end. The conflict is going to continue until there's an eventual winner. What is your position exactly on the negotiations? Would negotiations be acceptable in certain circumstances, in certain contexts, or would you rule out a negotiated settlement as being viable?
Look, I think this whole issue of negotiation is unfortunately overwhelming commentators and analysts. That's not the issue. The issue arises from answering honestly the following question. How is it possible that Russia, which has an economy the size of New York City, has been able to achieve what it has achieved against the democratic West, let's use that terminology, which accounts for more than half of the world economy? The problem that we have in all of this is there is no self-assessment. My biggest concern is the loss, and it's coming to the point of, I think, virtually a total loss of our deterrence credibility, not only with Russia, but when it comes to Iran, China, North Korea, so on and so forth. You cannot approach the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine from the standpoint of, well, we'll just impose costs. All that does is impose a price tag on a surrender of part of the so-called international order. We have rules. We have the law of the sea. We have borders. We have national sovereignty. You cannot sell parts of it away. When we go outside and we drive our car, there is a red light. You stop. There can be no exceptions. There can be no excuse. You stop at a red light. If you don't, there's an enforcement mechanism. Countries have courts. There's the police. There are penalties. What do we have in the international area? We don't. We have nothing other than what we are trying to do right now, which is to enforce the rules. You stop at another country's border. You can't negotiate that. If you negotiate that, you negotiate everything else. Unfortunately, our culture, our DNA, our psychology, our societies are a mercantile culture. We believe on agreements, negotiation, compromise. And when we achieve an agreement on any issue in our daily lives, in our social existence, an agreement means the end of the problem. We've solved the problem. We have an agreement, period. It's signed, everybody goes home. That is not the way it has ever been in Moscow. No issue of any importance to Moscow in none of those areas has an agreement been complied with. Whereas on the other end, when it comes to Europe or the United States, we rely on the agreement and we get ourselves into a corner. So I will end this general response to you with two observations that you should think about, I think. After World War II, the United States was number one in the world, militarily, economically, by every yardstick. What happened in 35 years after that? That was being lost tremendously. The Soviet Union was gaining, achieving strategic strength. And if it didn't fall apart because of the non-Russian secession of the non-Russian republics, who knows what would have happened? We had the same thing after the Soviet Union fell apart. Again, the United States was number one again. Korea was far away, China was far away, Iran. And look where we are now, 35 years later. In both instances, when you look at things from the very, very broad perspective, in both time periods, between World War II and the 1980s and between 1990 and today, we had agreements upon agreement upon agreement with Moscow. What utility has that been other than us having the situation we have now? We have not examined ourselves. Forget about trying to understand Russian psychology. We don't understand our own psychology and why we keep on repeating the same mistakes endlessly, and very often with the same so-called expert advice that got us into this problem in the first place. Fiona Hill, who was the National Security Advisor for Russian Affairs under Trump, in September of 2004, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and the title of the article was "Stop Criticizing Putin and Start Helping Him." She went on to become the advisor to Trump. We have made mistakes upon mistakes upon mistakes, and this negotiation, what is the signal for China? What's the signal for any country?
Yeah, of course.
We have not explored that avenue. And unfortunately, because of the lack of historical awareness, it's a little bit better among Europeans, but even among Europeans, it's very poor. But when it comes to Americans, it's disastrous. Americans don't even know their own history. They don't know the difference between Austria and Australia or Switzerland or Sweden. And when you talk to them about the record of the past, the precedents, the patterns of behavior, both by Moscow and by us, they don't want to hear it. They don't understand it. They're not interested. And unfortunately, the patterns of behavior in the past are the only predictor that we have of the future. That is the only thing we have to plan and anticipate for the future. And those predictors, when it comes to negotiation and agreements with Russia, are disastrous. Things are won or lost on the ground. You don't always have an agreement. And I think it would be redundant, at least for the three of you that are conducting this interview, it would be redundant for me to recite all of the breaches and violations that have been committed by Russia. It's more important, I think, for us to understand why do we still insist to think and talk in those terms. It will be cataclysmic. It is moving in that direction right now.
It's
Not
also
because of Russia, but because of the appetite that we are feeding with other tyrannies around the world.
You talked, Victor, about rules, so violating somebody else's border. But there are also behavioral rules, even in war. We have the Geneva Convention, for example. Russia is blatantly, deliberately breaking those rules to test our resolve, how we respond. And we respond by banning Ukraine or forbidding Ukraine from using weapons to their full potential. That's a heck of a message we're sending to Moscow, isn't it?
Well, let me make two comments about it. The overall concern, from what I can see here, is the absolute absence of people in Washington who know and understand Russian psychology. They don't understand that the only country, the only people that Russia fears are people who are not afraid of Russia. And if you are, then you are a target. The concern in Washington has been we don't want a nuclear war. We don't want World War III. Nobody has looked at it from the standpoint of Russia or China, and that is that capitulation to unilateral nuclear blackmail is precisely what is putting us on the path of global war, simultaneous enemies in Asia with Russia, and I am only waiting for South America to blow up. Mutual deterrence, which kept the peace in the so-called Cold War, has been thrown out the window, and we now have unilateral nuclear blackmail. Why wasn't Putin afraid of invading Ukraine? Why wasn't he deterred? Once we start condemning something, we've lost deterrence. Once we accepted the Minsk Accords, once we accepted the annexation of Crimea, what stronger invitation could we have had for a further invasion by Russia?
William,
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would also make some comments. I think that having, proposing, supporting negotiations right now or even in the near future it's a trap. It's a trap because on the one hand, Putin doesn't want to have negotiations. He doesn't want to lose anything, and a second point is that if he wants to negotiate, it's only with the United States to be at the same level, at the top level of any negotiation, and certainly not with Ukraine, and certainly not with the European Union as a power. Now, I think that we are the spectators of the sunset of the West. And it started with Iraq, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and a lot of other issues. And this is a source of a serious concern. So I think that we are losing our credibility more and more, and we see that every day, I would say. There was a time when President Macron was saying, "Oh, we will send troops, maybe troops." He was very ambiguous about the nature of the French people that he would send to Ukraine. Wow, there was an outcry against such a possible initiative in the European countries. And now Putin is opening its borders to North Korean soldiers, and there is no reaction in the European Union, except some word, some protest, but very, very low level. Negotiations would be absolutely accepted by European countries because they want that war to come to an end. And so it is also very attractive for Putin to say to the European Union, okay, let's fix the way this conflict in one way or another, of course, the best way for himself. And he knows that the European Union countries would accept any deal so that at the end, especially Germany, but not only Germany, they can go on doing business. The European Union is, in fact, a merchant power, but certainly not a military power. It has no teeth and no claws, and it doesn't want to fight to defend its values and to protect those who defend the values of the European Union. That is just the minimum service. And only step by step and a very difficult process, promising all the time. But what the Ukrainians receive to defend themselves is, well, very far from what is needed for a small country in comparison with a small population, now less than 40 million versus 140 million or maybe a little bit more on the Russian side. So it's really a trap to talk and to try to have negotiations with Putin, and I would even say at any time. So that was my first comment.
Well, let me make an observation about another element in addition to fear and self-paralysis and self-deterrence on the part of certainly the United States, because Europe does not have, as you said, the military capacity. It has some through primarily through Great Britain and France, but that's not going to be exercised. The other thought process, sometimes it's articulated, sometimes it's not, is that we have to give Putin something because he feels he needs it, because otherwise he'll lose public support, so on and so forth. That is absolute insanity. Again, an indicator, an example of the failure of Americans and Westerners generally to understand the system of repression that Putin has put in place. His example and his poster boy, his hero, being Stalin, celebrating Stalin's birthday in 1999, even before he became president. He can leave if he wants. He can leave Ukraine totally. He can surrender Crimea. He will not lose his position. He has a 250,000 man Praetorian Guard. He can spin this any number of ways. The population in Russia is passive. Every person is siloed in his own individual little world. They want to be left alone. They don't want to be involved. They are not going to march on the streets, protesting that Putin moved out. Another element I'll suggest to you that factors into this. Let's imagine that in 2014, Russia invaded Italy and annexed Sicily, which even looks geographically a little bit like the Crimean Peninsula, and occupied the southern part of Italy. Or let's assume it invaded and occupied part of Germany, France, Denmark, England, okay? Or Poland, or even the Latvian country, the Baltic countries, or Finland, and assume for purposes of my illustration that none of these countries are in NATO. Let's assume NATO doesn't even exist. If that happened in 2014, how long do you think that situation would have been allowed to exist by the world community, by Europe, by the United States? How long would we have tolerated it? Would we have accepted the annexation of Sicily and occupation of part of Italy? What I'm getting at here is that unlike other countries, even tiny countries like Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or Belgium, unlike those countries, Ukraine does not have the same identity in the emotions, the feelings, the understanding, and in the intellectual understanding of Europeans or Americans. Even though Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, it's about the size of England, Germany, Hungary, and Israel combined. The European and generally the Western public has been absorbing for fully a century Tsarist imperial historiography, which absorbed Ukraine as quote unquote a part of Russia, as opposed to the other way around. And the attitude now, I encounter it sometimes actually articulated to me by diplomats and military, but not so much by military personnel, the thought is that, well, yes, Ukraine is important, and yes, it's a founding member of the United Nations, and it's an independent country, and we have international rules we have to enforce. But somehow, Ukraine it was part of Russia, so Russia is very angry, and it's really entitled to have at least some of Ukraine back. It is not a distinct
country.
Political entity separate and apart from Russia, as is Portugal. The shock factor has not been sufficient. And that is one element that maintains the passivity and the reluctance for further aid and involvement, in addition to what I mentioned to you, the factor about self-deterrence because of fear and so on and so forth. I've written about that in several instances. In 2004, I wrote a letter to Condoleezza Rice when she was the National Security Advisor, and I warned her that Putin would invade Ukraine, and how the United States reacted to that would determine what happens globally with North Korea and Iran. And if it was not a strong enough response, then everything would be collapsing around our head. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we're seeing now.
In fact, Russia has always been an imperialistic power, whether under the Tsars or under the Soviet Union, and now with Putin. I think we must keep that in mind, which is not really the case with our leaders in the European Union, a Slavic imperialistic power.
Yeah, license plates and decals on car bumpers in Russia, when they say "forward to Berlin," that says something. When Putin tells you Russia has no borders,
yes,
I this will come to pass. I predicted several years ago that Russia is going to raise claims. It will challenge the Russian-American border in Alaska. Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister in the 1930s, suggested to Stalin that Stalin assert claims to Alaska, even though Alaska at that time was not yet an American state. Well, that was not done, but you're hearing that increasingly in the Russian Duma. We think it's a joke here. Well, it's not a joke. It will come. It's part of a pressure point.
and Russia is not so far from Canada, North America, let's say Canada and the United States. Well, if you imagine that you are flying just above the North Pole, there is just a sea between them. It's not a matter of distance around the terrestrial globe. And
it's about 60 kilometers.
Yes, yeah. So it's very close to the United States and to Canada. So they should be concerned.
Let me intervene a little bit. I appreciate very much Mr. Rud for his comment, but that brings us to the question of the nature of this conflict. Because Russia is not just an imperial state; it is last imperial state. Let me say so, and there is some kind of key one fault, because we were the people who created, in fact, that kind of empire. And I believe that right now the history made its complete cycle, and in Kiev the history of Russian Empire should end. It's my belief. But if we are speaking about again about the nature of the conflict, it is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. And I imagine that not everybody in the West understands that or want to accept that idea. It is a war and struggle between the two social systems, two civilizations, let me say so. Because what the Russian Empire was built on, it is a principle that the state is the center of universe, and all the people circling around that center, and the life and the fate of the separate person worth nothing. The Western civilizations, which Ukrainian now try to join, built on another principle than the human being in the center of universe, and all the state institutions and services like circling and serving to his interests. And there is no middle between that two systems. Unfortunately, Ukraine now appeared to be in the center of the struggle of these two civilizations, human civilizations, but still they are absolutely totally different.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's mean that there could not be some kind of agreement between them. There could be only annihilation, unfortunately. I am very sad to say so. So if we are speaking about the negotiations, it is inevitably appeared the questions, a negotiation about what? About the confession of the territories, about because for Ukrainians became the Russian slavery again, or about the complete genocide of Ukrainian populations. But what you see now, Russian not only fight on the battlefield, they killing civilian Ukrainians on occupied territories. And they do that intentionally because they knew for sure, even if they obtain some kind of success on the battlefield and will control Ukraine as a such, it will not mean that the war is over, because the ground will be burning under the occupiers' legs. And that means that they now trying to destroy the active population on occupied territory, which in the future could resist their oppression. And
well,
this
I'm glad you use the term war and not conflict, which actually we tend to use. That's terribly wrong. You know, on the issue of negotiation that we raised earlier, and you mentioned it now, the issue is, right, what's the issue, number one? Number two, who is supposed to be negotiating? The entirety of the Western world should then be a signatory to that document. Let me give you two quotations. Leon Trotsky: you may not be interested in the war, but the war is interested in you. The second one, from the Irish poet William Butler Yeats: the best are full of complacency, the worst are full of passionate intensity. It goes to the point you made that there is no appreciation that this appears to be a quote unquote conflict. Well, Russians want some land. Of course, Ukrainians don't want to give them the land. So let's compromise and give them some land or something. That is not what this is all about. Russia has said many, many times that is not the essence of what this is about. If you read Alexander Dugin's Geopolitics in 1997, it is a campaign against the West, where Russia wants to align itself with Iran, where the European Union is supposed to be broken up, where England is to be split off, which is what happened, and where the main enemy is the United States. This is a global, increasingly global event that has brought in, as we said, other countries, a nuclear North Korea and China, and a soon-to-be Iran. Anybody who thinks that Iran is going to surrender its drive for nuclear weapons, I think they are totally wrong. And we don't have it straight in our own head how big the stakes are, how big the fundamental issue is. We are going to be surprised, I mean the United States and Europe, but more so the United States, is going to be surprised, as it was in World War II, when the bombs actually fall on American territory.
Yeah.
People then wake up. But that may not even happen here because bombs are not necessary to subvert the United States or indeed Europe. You know as well as I know that the process of subversion, of the invasion and occupation of our brains, of our emotions, has been underway for decades. And it's enormously successful, partially because we're doing it ourselves, because we are corrupt. Our people, our politicians, many of them are corrupt. The public does not understand it. People are bought by positions, by money, so on and so forth. And it is something that Putin understands perfectly. He studies and he admires Stalin, not just because of terror and repression and homicidal Russification. He admires Stalin because Stalin was able to play with the psychology of the West until the very, very last minute, basically until he died. So going to your point that this is a much, much greater event. It is not a conflict. It is not a Ukraine conflict. It is, on the one hand, a war on Ukraine, but where Ukraine is the pivot point, it's the fulcrum to tip over everything that has been established and everything that the world suffered in the last two world wars, basically throughout the 20th century, and what was built up, and it is now dissolving. We have to wake up to it very, very quickly.
I agree with you that it is more and more obvious in the perception of our European political leaders that it is a war against the West. And since February 2022, I think we are having three different wars. In fact, we had a first war by Putin to control Ukraine and to make it a second Belarus, in fact, and this failed. And then it was more and more obvious that it was a war against NATO countries, against the West. And now the next step is the objective of Putin is to change the world order. And it's still part, of course, of the war against the West. It's just to reduce the role, the influence, the impact that the West can have on the whole of the planet. And of course, on the dictatorships of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and so on and so on. Since February 2022, we have seen different steps in the strategy that I think was not really planned that way by Putin. And it's after the failure of the first attack against Ukraine that it changed the nature of his aggression against the West. But now it's really the world order that he wants to be changed.
Excuse me. I don't agree with that. What has changed since February is timing.
Yes.
It's been delayed. But the goals, the purposes are the same. Nothing has changed. He has been articulating for years what he continues to articulate even louder now.
Yeah.
The only thing that changed, as I said, is there's a stumbling block. There's a bump on the road, and it has delayed him for the 2.5 years or whatever it is right now. So, when you listen to the Russian public statements, and here again is an example of how wrong our psychology is. When we listen to the media, the television, or whatever comes out of Russia, we always describe this, well, RT is controlled by the government. This television station is controlled by the government. We are still infected in our minds by the concept that what in the West are democratic institutions, the media, is separate from the government. And in Russia's case, we transplant that and we say it's controlled by the government. No, the media is the government. It is a small point, but it's a distinction that tells you how we continue to think about the degree of control that exists within Russia. And if anybody says anything, that's essentially the government talking, and we can't dismiss it. So, but other than this point that I have to disagree with you, Willie, about a change in since February, I think it's more timing than substance.
No, I agree with you. I understand what you are saying. And of course, it has always been a war against the West, but with successive episodes. And if he had won the first one, so taking control of Belarus, the next step, of course, would have been different, but he failed there. And so that's why he put the NATO countries under pressure from a lot of angles. And now the step that we see, especially with the Kazan conference, is that he really wants to crush the world order as it was established by the West after the Second World War. In fact, we don't disagree. Maybe I had some form of expression that was not appropriate.
No, I understand your point. Maybe the point is he is saying it more often, perhaps. But to my mind, that was always the purpose. Again, going back 20 years when I wrote the letter, and I at the Condoleezza Rice, I wrote it to every member of Congress and to everybody in the foreign policy arena. I received one response from Professor Brzezinski. And he knew and he understood what I was saying and why. At that time, it was viewed as too extreme. We still have our Lutfest. You remember the parade of admirers from every European country that marched to the Kremlin to kiss the ring of Putin, where he was going to be the new democratic force and the savior of Russia. And as people said in the West, the Cold War is over. No, they don't know and they don't understand. When somebody comes in and starts celebrating Hitler and reintroduces Nazi insignia in Germany and starts using the melody of Deutschland über alles in the German national anthem, how long would we tolerate that? It didn't make any impact on us when it was done in Russia by Putin. Celebrating Stalin's executioners, the melody of the Soviet anthem, the Soviet star, the hammer and sickle still appearing, the introduction of the hammer and sickle at Salt Lake City, Utah in the Winter Olympics in February of 2002, I believe it was. No news commentator, no professor, no politician, no military person in the West raised a question. Why are we having Soviet symbols after the Soviet Union fell apart? It was irrelevant. It was something to joke about. And that is part of the burden we have psychologically and emotionally to properly assess and react to what's happening. We are, I'm afraid, very, very much our own worst enemies.
The West has completely lost its way. I think that's one thing that we all agree on. What do we do about this? I mean, how do we change this? It's easy to say, well, we can look to America for guidance or for strength, and a certain amount of continuity. But I'm following the presidential elections at the moment. I couldn't vote for either of those guys. I mean, and I think if I were American, I would instinctively be a Republican. I would vote Republican. I don't think I could do that now. But would I vote for the other one as a protest? I couldn't do this. I mean, I think the US has ceased to be the guide, as it were, that it has been in the post-war years.
It unfortunately, I think it's I think it's right at the edge, right at the precipice. I agree with you about the elections, of course. The first time around when Trump was president, at least he had some actually some pretty good people around him, unfortunately, that he either dismissed or they left. And I don't think we can rely on, if he becomes president again, I don't think we can rely on having those type of people around him again. And with Kamala Harris, well, I don't see a more robust, a better informed, a more active position taken by her than the Biden administration. And one of the big ironies, one of the huge disappointments is when people talk about Taiwan, they don't seem to understand that Taiwan does not present any issue under international law. The issue of of national sovereignty does not exist. The issue of territorial inviolability and borders does not exist. Why? Because Taiwan is not recognized. We ourselves withdrew recognition, we being America, withdrew recognition of Taiwan in 1979. We sacrificed Taiwan for China. We said China and Taiwan are the same country. How can we be expected by anybody around the world to robustly defend against Chinese aggression against Taiwan if we don't do it in Ukraine, which is a founding member of the UN, where the issues of borders and sovereignty have never been under question, where Ukraine surrendered the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world at the time, equal, third behind the US, China, and then Ukraine. US, Russia, and then Ukraine. So if those are not reasons enough to defend the so-called order in Ukraine, then you're not going to find it with Taiwan, or frankly I can't think of any other country, quite honestly. It is not a very good situation. I will say, however, one thing which is of a positive nature, and that is, as the United States and Russia, I should say the United States and the Soviet Union, a key difference. As we were losing ground to the Soviet Union under this so-called policy of containment that failed, we did not contain the Soviet Union. As we were losing our relative military capacity, we were at the same time trying to preserve the unity of the Soviet Union and arguing against Ukraine and wishing other republics in the Soviet Union would not declare independence. Fortunately, Ukraine, the Baltic countries, and others ignored that, declared independence, and all of a sudden, the United States was great again. Soviet Union fell apart. America went to the top of the charts. Now, with almost an equal time frame from World War II to the 1980s, and now from 1990 until today, about 35 years, we have a comparable time frame. We have things moving in not a good direction. It doesn't look good. And again, we're making many of the same mistakes we made with the Soviet Union. Not as bad, but we're still not doing what we should be doing. But I have some reason to believe that within Russia, there's not going to be any mass uprising The people are too passive. The powers of repression are too strong. But there is a growing movement among the non-Russian nations that are still subsumed and part of the, I will call it the internal Russian Empire, the so-called Russian Federation, that are going to increasingly give Putin a very, very serious threat to his stability. When and how that will unfold, I have no way of knowing. But it is there, and Putin is aware of it. Unfortunately, we are terrified of it. We want stability. We want predictability. We don't want that to happen. We didn't want that to happen with the Soviet Union. We don't want it to happen with Russian Federation. But I think it will happen anyway.
Where do you see that there is such a fracture between non-Russian peoples and Russian people in the Russian Federation? We don't see that from, I would say, from.
I think it is brewing in the Soviet Far East. Nations there are upset. There are open public demonstrations complaining that they are not receiving a return from Moscow on the resources that is being pumped, what they still view as being pumped out of their land. There are objections, there are protests in Central Asia. It has not undertaken any formal institutionalized expression. There have been two conferences, as I'm aware of a spontaneous, I can't recall the name. I think it is the United Nations in Russia that took place, one in Europe, one in Washington, that just finished. That is a longer term development. I think the potential is there. Unfortunately, it's speculative, as I say, and it is not going to help us now.
No.
The only thing is some sort of awakening, maybe North Korea, but I don't see a lot of. You're right, Willy. In Europe, the news is passive. North Korea invades Europe. So what, right?
Yeah. Sorry. The Baltic states, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, had already a history of statehood, I would say. But in the Siberia, you have, I would say, small ethnic group that I think don't have the capacity to fight for their independence and to create a state. I'm very doubtful.
You're right that these are at this point you want to call them ethnic groups, but they're more than that. They are self-identifying nations without a state. As a matter of fact, after World War I, after the Tsarist Empire fell apart in Siberia, there was a new state that was created, and their flag was the American flag, except the stars were snowflakes. It was a state that lasted for about 2 years, and then they were overwhelmed and all that. So I am not romanticizing this. I understand the lack of the state genealogy, and it's critical. Yes, I'm sorry, Dmytro, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just want to add something to that discussion. If we're speaking about the so-called minorities in Russia, they're not that little as we imagine. Because, for instance, such ethnicity, people like Bashkir, Tatar, they have their own history, and it's very important. They have hundreds of years of fighting against Russian Empire. And I again want to confirm what we are seeing now, this is the logical end of the entire Russian Empire. And as you really mentioned, the post-Soviet Republic breakthrough from the Great Russia, let me say so. It was just the beginning of the process. It was understanding that these people could live separately. And coming back to the conflict in Ukraine, and what does it mean? For ages, the Russian Empire was funded on the violence against the ethnic minorities on that suburbs. And that's mean that these ethnic groups could fight for their freedom in the conditions then the Russian states, like as such, all this oppression machine is weakening.
Yeah.
And that bring me to another point. Mr. Rud, you mentioned that the West is losing ground, was losing ground in the fight with the Soviet Union, and now it is losing ground in the fight with Russia. I cannot agree with that, because the very simple reason. All these human, military, nuclear, so on and so forth power Russia was threatening the West, in reality, in real circumstances, war in Ukraine appeared to be a fake. And that, raise another question.
Yes.
What kind of illusion have the West concerning the Russian Empire, where they spend these huge amounts of money for weapons and so on and so forth? For what? To appear to be unable to resist right now? Yeah, I can say you about absolutely obvious thing. Mr. Borrell was coming to the US, to UN General Assembly, and he was having a speech in some kind of Hopkins University, and he said a very simple thing. NATO asking us to have like 300 soldiers to high readiness to be part in the international forces. And we started to look for this might. And you know what? We discovered that in all 27 member states, we have like 1,500,000 soldiers on active duty, and only 10% of them are combat ready. What does it mean? If we're speaking, for instance, about the EU assistance to Ukraine right now, it is not because EU don't want to assist us in a proper way. That means that they have no ability to assist us in a proper way. Because those famous initiatives, for instance, Estonian initiative to provide us with 1 million shells was not completed. That means...
I'm familiar with all of that. I understand that very, very, very well. When I said that the West was losing ground to the Soviet Union, it was losing ground to the Soviet Union despite the fact that its estimation of Soviet capacity, let's just talk about its military capacity, was grossly overestimated. And its ability, we credited the Soviet Union with an ability far greater than it had. And we have always done that. We have always done that. A year after the end of World War II, London forbid the Polish Free Army to march in the Victory Parade in London because they didn't want to upset the Russians, as they said it. They were terrified, and all of Europe was, and so was the United States, of what they assumed was a massive Red Army capacity at the end of World War II. There was almost no capacity, and whatever it had was built on American Lend-Lease assistance. We have that historic pattern of attributing more capacity on the conventional military side. On the other hand, we have almost no ability to accurately assess the power and the effectiveness of non-military conquest and control that Russia has always exhibited and perfected through centuries. Propaganda is a poor word to describe Russian abilities in doing what they do to undermine. They wage war against entire countries, societies, populations. They wage war against the brain.
Brainwashing.
They will win. If they win, they will win with words. Ultimately, this is the use of words. And they will win, if they win in Ukraine and elsewhere, with words. More than military capacity, shooting, or anything else.
And
If they win, they will win in the capitals of Europe and in Washington. That's where the battle is won.
The obvious question: what role of NATO is in all these games? Because NATO is not like the organization which rely only to words. Or I am mistaken?
You cannot push a string.
NATO powers, because it's the political leaders of the NATO countries that decide.
You expect unanimity with more than 30 countries who has a capacity from America to Liechtenstein or Luxembourg.
Yeah.
Unanimity will never happen. But
that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Because we recognize that the collective West have much more military power and much more advanced weaponry systems than Russians have. But still, Russians have a will to use their notorious weapons. But all these powerful Western nations cannot agree even to allow us to defeat the Russian arsenal on their territory.
It's not important how big your rifle is.
No.
It's not important that your finger is on the trigger. It's the brain that controls the finger.
And the decision-making process.
And the only thing that would have awakened NATO was if there was, as I said, a theoretical invasion of one of the members, or the Russians dropped a bomb on Berlin or something. You need something that big and that dramatic to drive 30 cats together into one herd and one mentality. Short of that, it's not happening.
I think also a big issue is lack of leadership. No matter what we think of him, Putin is a leader. Russia has a leader. European Union doesn't. The European Union has 27 unelected civil servants sitting in the Berlaymont. And if you get all 27 of them together, you're going to get 28 opinions. It's a complete, and Dmytro, you will know better than most, because I know that you're engaging with the Commission quite often. There is no leadership, is there? And, however, they have competence in so many areas that the member states themselves are not always able to act as they wish, because maybe that competence has been transferred through the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, the Lisbon Treaty, to Brussels, to the European Commission.
Putin is a leader by dictate. And he takes advantage and flips on its head what is democracy, one of democracy's greatest strengths, which is a rich reservoir of multiple views and multiple contributions, but that is a guarantee of a lack of unity if you can exploit it. And he has been able to do it. We don't have anybody, not from the dictate perspective, because obviously with democratic societies, we cannot expect to have a leader with the immediate consequence that Putin has. But we don't have the leader that we had with some of the great past, the great leaders of history, most recently, in my estimation, from the United States side, being President Reagan.
Exactly. I'm in complete agreement with you there. We need
that kind of leader who can be a leader against the democratic milieu that he has to operate in. We don't have it. And it's not Trump and it's not Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
And I don't see anybody on the European side
Certainly not.
Yeah.
They are replaced all the time, every 4 years, maximum every 4 years. It's another
The
leader.
revolving door.
They make promises, a lot of blah blah, but it will
Possibly
play.
the only, Willy, amongst the European member states, the European Union member states, possibly the most vocal and the most decisive are actually those who are in Putin's pocket, aren't they? Orban says what he wants to say, does what he wants to say. We've got Fico, we've got some of the new member states coming in. If that happens, but they're very much in Putin's pocket.
Yeah.
Putin, he's choreographed everything so well over the last 20 years. It's just incredible. Let us just look at Hungary there. Hungary wants to leave Schengen. If Hungary leaves Schengen, to join Schengen, as I understand. The plan or the threat there is that Russians would be able to fly in pretty much unchecked and then leave unchecked, because we would be trusting Orban's security people to man the borders. Now, there's a very good reason why Bulgaria was kept out of Schengen for so long, because, of course, Borisov was very much in Putin's pocket. I see everything unraveling in front of our eyes.
Yeah, there are many holes in the racket of the European Union, you say. I'm a tennis player, so that's why I use that expression that is very, very common here. But I think that you said that Putin had planned, let's say, his offensive in the last 20 years very intelligently, and I agree with you. And I think that at the end, if I can use that expression, he perceives the NATO as a paper tiger. Not because, of course, he could be afraid of the weaponry of the NATO, but nobody is able to push immediately on the button that should be necessary to be triggered.
But look, Willy, look at our naivete in the West.
Oh, yes.
Commentators, academics, politicians who say Putin is afraid of NATO, that's why he invaded Ukraine. That means that he has no idea that the electorate in every single NATO country would never, ever support any kind of negative invasion, assault against Russia, right? I mean, you need the political will to do something like that. That means he has no spies in Brussels. Stalin knew about the formation of NATO even before the first telegram went out from President Roosevelt to Winston Churchill. He knew about it. Somebody's going to tell me that Russia is afraid of NATO? No, that's the big drum to beat in order to put us on the psychological disadvantage of, well, if he's afraid of NATO, we have to make sure he is not afraid of NATO. We have to act nice. The most effective tool of Russian mind control,
manipulation,
is accuse, demand, attack, complain, and blame. And you put your target in a psychologically retreating mentality.
Vulnerability.
No, this is a game that parties could play together. You know, why not the Western world allow itself to not maybe to copy the Russians' behavior, but still to have the political will. For instance, why we don't have relied to? Okay, I understand. This still could sound tricky, but for Macron initiative to send the troops to Ukraine, it was such an initiative announced publicly, so that why not support it? And you mentioned just that there should be some kind of shock blow for NATO to awaken. But there is I have only two remarks about that. it is not possible that Russia will stop its expansion. That's mean, as President Biden mentioned earlier, if Ukraine will fall, the next will be Poles and the Baltic states, for instance. And that bring me to my next question. You were speaking about the scale of the war right now we have in Ukraine. Isn't it in the best Western interest to finish that war with Russia and to finish Russian Empire in Ukraine now, than to do that in few years or in few decades, okay, in Baltic states, which are much smaller and that could be destroyed by Russia in one day. It is not because they are bad soldiers, just because they are very small in territory.
Look, you're preaching to the choir. I agree with you 100%. I was going to make a comment earlier, but I'll do it right now. And I don't think this is the case. But if I was very, very optimistic, and if I were very, very hopeful, I would suggest that possibly one of the reasons that the Biden administration, in addition to the other reasons I articulated, by the way, my screen, I just have myself on the screen. Is everybody else still on this, or did something happen?
Yeah,
It's okay.
Everybody else is on? Okay.
Yeah.
So I lost it. I don't know why, but that's okay.
Oh, it changes just because you're speaking. It's focused on you.
I got you.
Uh-huh.
It is possible. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible that the reason for this go slow approach recently, right now, including the relative passivity about North Korean troops, is that this is so close to the election that if Biden was going to do anything drastic, it would immediately reflect on Kamala Harris.
Of course.
And it would support, it would be support for a Trump win. If I was his advisor, I would tell him, do nothing now.
Of course.
Do not do anything that would increase the possibility of Trump winning. And after the election results are in, then we could do something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a
I think
thought.
we can expect. Yeah, I think we can expect some moves after the 5th of November. I hope so. Then it will be.
Watching that with some trepidation.
Excuse me?
I said November the 5th. We'll be watching this with some trepidation, I fear.
Yeah.
I think the whole world will be doing so, and particularly not just the current and future victims of tyrants, but their own populations. Look at the resource that we have with China in terms of the suppression of their people. And yet we're not exploiting that. We're not exploiting the possibility for a challenge of that regime internally. Right? Look at North Korea. We just sit back, we do nothing. Now,
I just want to quickly, is everybody okay for time?
yes,
okay.
I am. I actually wanted to say something. I've been probably monopolizing this conversation a little bit too much, but
No.
there's one observation that I want to make, and that is the absolute necessity to understand how we behave and why, and try to focus on that, because without that, I'm not optimistic. So let me walk this by you. All of you are of an age that you will be much more sensitive to my discussing World War II and the aftermath and the present day and a pattern of behavior. Let me go through this very, very quickly and think about how all of that reflects with today's headlines. In the 1920s and 30s, we put the Soviet Union on its feet economically. We built it up economically. At the same time, the Soviet Union was building up the German war machine allowing Germany to sidestep the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Rapallo between post-war Germany, post-World War I Germany, and the Soviet Union put the Nazi regime on its feet. We extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, the United States, in 1933, even though the Soviet Union swore to destroy the capitalist devil, which was America. But we extended diplomatic recognition. At the same time, it broke the back of Ukrainian resistance by the mass starvation of Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. Soviet political and military doctrine was to turn Nazi Germany against the West and then to clean up in Europe after the conquest of European countries by Nazi Germany. They formed an alliance in 1939 with Hitler, as you know, between Molotov and Ribbentrop. That didn't happen because Germany attacked the Soviet Union. We turned around 180 degrees, the United States, and treated the Soviet Union as a victim. And it took us 5 years between the end of the war and 1950 to realize that the Soviet Union never changed its goal. Okay. We organized the UN. The Soviet Union was a member. Russia never was a member. When the Soviet Union fell apart, we ignored one second, please. We ignored the rules of admission into the United Nations and got Russia to take the place of the Soviet Union on the Security Council.
Yeah.
That was unlawful. The United Nations capitulated. Its own rules were being violated. Ukraine, a founding member, was not. Today, Gutierrez, despite the UN's International Criminal Court indicting Putin as a war criminal against children, Gutierrez bows down in front of Putin. So you have this massive constancy and consistency of huge strategic mistakes being made over and over again by the United States and by Europe, by West, vis-a-vis Moscow, throughout the century. I can give you more examples, more and more and more, but there is a constant. And the elements are the competition, basically capitalism, money. What do you think Nord Stream 2 was all about, right? Nothing more than money. Money, ignorance, in some cases, simply, unfortunately, I hate to use the word, stupidity.
Naivety.
And also, very critically, the categoric refusal to listen to the experience and to advice of millions and millions and tens of millions of people who have the experience that Brussels, London, Paris, Rome, and Washington have never had in dealing with Russia. In every single endeavor in our life, fixing a computer, playing golf, brain surgery, whatever it is, you always want a person who has experience. You pay for people with experience. But in our dealing with Moscow for a century, we ignored this experience. We ignored the advice. Not only did we dismiss these people, we made fun of them. And in post-war Europe, in World War II, Gary had an article on it. We killed them. Refugees from the Soviet Union were forcibly repatriated by US and British troops back to the Soviet Union. We did not want to hear their message.
Yeah.
And if you go to the dictionary and you look up the definition of the word keel haul, Operation Keel Haul, you will see that we viewed these people as criminals that have to be punished because they told us things we don't want to listen to.
Yeah.
Those elements are still with us. They're still with us. How do we deal with it?
And Gutierrez shook hands with Putin in Kazan. And Gutierrez also had a big hug with Lukashenko.
Everything that I'm not familiar with you gentlemen personally, other than Gary. We've had communication through the years, of course. But everything that you do, this discussion that we're having right now, every single minute you spend on these issues is precisely what we have to be doing. We do not have a choice otherwise.
Yeah.
There is no choice. It has to continue. So that is my unfortunately perhaps too long an observation, but it's something to me that is so clear that I just can't emphasize it enough.
I mean, one thing that was not really touched upon, maybe talking about Putin's influence over certain national governments, particularly leaders, is the traditional, the Soviet tradition of brainwashing, infiltration. We're seeing now, at a very tense period, the revival of the student activist. Yeah? Okay, so they would have the hammer and sickle, and then they would produce whatever it was else that might mess us up. At the moment it's Palestinian flags. They want to free Gaza when they're not trying to bring down capitalism, or they want to stop oil. Everything that can be done to destabilize us, to confuse public opinion. We're seeing much more of this than we've seen for some decades now.
Yes. So. It's part of the toolbox. You remember all the protests in Europe against the United States, right? And the bomb. Well, the bomb isn't the problem. Russia has a bomb, but it was converted. A steel tube with nuclear material in it was converted into a global campaign against the main country that would only use it in defense against the aggressor, and never a word of complaint, of course, or protest against the potential aggressor. There is a demonic brilliance in how effective these campaigns are becoming and were in the past. And yes, the talent and ability that Russia has exhibited, although it isn't always, I should say, brilliance, because a lot of it has to do with our own weaknesses as human beings, as democratic societies, as people who have a poor knowledge, because we have a poor interest in these kind of things. We've never had to deal with it truly in our day-to-day lives. So the population, the electorate, is more interested in the football game.
But sometimes we had some courageous leaders, and I think concrete example at the time of the pacifist waves in the 1980s in the West, and that was Mitterrand, who said the pacifists are on the West and the missiles are on the East.
Yes.
That quotation has remained throughout the decades since then, and I think it was a courageous statement that he made at that time. Short, but really targeted.
I have a question for all four of you. After October 7th of last year, coverage of Ukraine has pretty much disappeared, certainly in the United States. Why, and particularly given the increasing ferocity and acceleration of the war. What is your explanation for the radical drop in coverage of the sort for the general public, on the evening news in Europe?
Fatigue. I think it's something that happens. It's because we're probably more aware than the average man or woman on the street, or indeed any of the other alternatives on the street these days. We follow current affairs, world events in much more detail than most people. For most, the invasion by Russia was a bit of a novelty. It was interesting, but after more than 2 years, it just drops off the radar. I think it's just a natural phenomenon, unfortunately.
But it wasn't gradual. You could cut it with a knife in October of last year with what happened with Gaza and Hamas. It fell off the cliff almost within 24 hours. Yeah. I understand, the staleness, if you will, of continual genocide. I hate to put it that way. But it was sharp. That is what has puzzled me. Any views, Willy or Dmytro?
It's already, we have like a war going on 3 years. As a person who is working in information news agency, I can say you that news have unfortunately a very short term of living. So yesterday's news are not, playground to today. So today we need today's news. The very horrible thing on this is that irrespective of how media cover the events in Ukraine, the people there still continue to die. In a fighting, they are dying under the Russian bombs. And, this is happening in the scale which in normal conditions could horrify the Western public, because they show sympathy, for instance, for Palestinians now, and rightly so, but who are dying under the Israeli bombs. But from another point of view, we need always to remember what happened in October last year. And it is not Israel who initiated all these horrible things. But again, I'm absolutely sure that the general public is against the mass killing on any kind. But right now, just in behind, you have a mass killing which is going on every day and every hour. I am not speaking now about the battlefield, about the combat where the military is fighting each other. I'm speaking about the absolutely targeting from Russian side the civil infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and we every day have news the children died under the Russian missiles. Only last year we have like 8,000 Russian missiles fall onto the Ukrainian cities. Can you imagine that picture? It is horrible. Only one day in this March, we have the attack. We involved 300 one day, 300 missiles and drones against the Kiev and the major Ukrainian cities. This is a global crime. This is genocide now going on the eyes of the Western citizens. And it is not a surprise for me, because we are not complaining. It is our fight first of all, but everything will be changed, and people can understand it is not just our fight. We are fighting also for their ability and they allow them to live in peace right now, because again, Russia is the absolutely damaging social system. They cannot not to expand. That means they will go further after Ukraine. That means that Poland, Baltic states, and maybe some other Western countries will be next. When the West realize that, on the top level, they already understand that. But on the ground level, still among the wider public, that understanding should be, how to say, rigid.
I think Gary used the right word. There is fatigue at all levels, everywhere. And what I had noticed after more than 2 years of warfare, that the media don't know what else to say about the conflict. What is new that we should comment on? Now they have the North Korean soldiers coming to the front line. Okay, to Kursk most probably. So we can develop again our discourse for those who are, I would say, on the right side. But what I also have noticed is the way that the media have covered the events in let's say in the Middle East, so Gaza, the Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., and the conflict on Ukraine. I heard voices saying, "Oh, Netanyahu, I'm not for Netanyahu. Netanyahu should stop shelling, bombing the south of Lebanon or Gaza, etc., etc." But I didn't hear the same voices saying the same about Ukraine and about the number of civilians killed every day, the number of children. We see the children in Gaza and in south of Lebanon that have been killed. Of course, it's not admissible, but nothing about the same situation in Ukraine. What else? Something else is that I heard from a spokesperson. I don't remember which one, from Amnesty International, to say Netanyahu should stop bombing the south of Lebanon and even the Beirut and so on and so on. I never heard the same voice saying from Amnesty International, Putin, please stop bombing civilians in Ukraine. So
Yes.
there is a double language and that's what I see in the mirror of the war with Gaza on the one hand and on the war on Ukraine on the other hand.
Well, Ukraine is facing a nuclear Russia, nuclear China, nuclear North Korea, and a soon-to-be nuclear Iran.
Yeah.
Israel itself is a nuclear power and
Yes.
doesn't face nuclear power. So you have the irony from that perspective as well.
Tragic irony, yes.
Yeah. And you look at the geography of Russia, you look at Ukraine, you look at, I mean, there are a lot of factors, and this irony and this inconsistency is very it's very troubling, and it is again part of the reason people, I think, just don't know what's going on. It's not being reported.
So I'm not
Gents,
very optimistic
but,
for the near future.
Sorry, Willy, could you just make that? I missed your final comment there.
No, I say I'm not very optimistic about the near future of the West.
No, I share your opinion there. I stopped being optimistic quite a long time ago.
Yeah. I remember that John Paul II, I'm not a Catholic, said, "Don't be afraid." And the Polish people followed his advice. And you saw what happened afterwards. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the whole of the Soviet Union. And now, and for years, Putin has made our Western powers afraid. And we are guilty for that, not him. He tried, and he's successful. He makes us afraid, and we accept everything that he does. He imposes on us his own tempo on the war, on diplomatic relations worldwide, and so on. And we just react sometimes, just with words, never with action.
Europeans, unfortunately, they think that it's a disaster and a catastrophe and a threat to them if their local store runs out of truffles. Russians are very different, indeed. And I think that we've become too comfortable and too soft. We have become too accepting of influences of people in our societies who really don't belong here. And so we've come to the point where we turn a blind eye to it. We come to a point where in Britain, for example, this last weekend, it's a criminal offence in Britain to hold any kind of literature or banner which glorifies Hamas or Hezbollah. It's a described organisation. And a young lady got into an altercation with one of them and said, "You people are terrorists, Hezbollah are terrorists." She was arrested by a police officer for hate crime. We have in Brussels, as you know, in the EU, Hamas is prescribed. You cannot give them a platform. 4 days after October 7th, Hamas was speaking at the press club in Brussels. We must be mad.
So far as I understand, our conversation coming to some kind of final. But I still, how to say, would like to argue against that pessimistic tone, because we on our position, we need how to say, to keep our mind in a positive mood. Why? Because from my perspective, myself is working with the wording, but wording and thinking, they are materialized sometimes and somehow. I don't know how, don't ask me. But what we are thinking, it will happen. That's mean that let us concentrate our attention, not to our weaknesses, but to our strength. And please realize that right now, this huge imperial Russian machine crushing in Ukraine, crushing right now, this minute, as we speak. So let us concentrate our effort, how to support that struggle, not to how to avoid that. And by the way, some of international organizations like NATO doing that successfully. But still, let us concentrate on what we can do and do that right now. Just to finalize my idea, we all, how to say, deserve the better future. We deserve to live in a democratic country. And what we are now facing, this is a global fight between the democracy and autocracy. Gentlemen, if we will be pessimistic about our democratic ability, we will lose the fight, because this is a pure military approach. You could never win the battle if you come to the battle to lose it. We coming to this battlefield to win, and we Ukrainians came to that battle to prevail. And I can assure you that is the last stage of the Russian Empire, and it will end on the Ukrainian territory. So, gentlemen, let us be brave like Ukraine. Thank you.
I cannot object to anything that you said. I endorse it. But I think for purposes of getting the message out, I wouldn't call it democracy versus autocracy. It's more than that. I would just characterize it democracy versus dictatorship. People viscerally, emotionally understand dictatorship. They have a certain image in their mind. Autocracy, I think that's more for, maybe the academics. But Dmytro, I agree with you 100%. Look, the Soviet Union fell apart. It was a big surprise to everybody, except to who? Yeah. Who was not surprised? Everybody living in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But outside of the Soviet Union, it was a shock overnight. How is this possible? Well, because you don't understand the centrifugal forces that were suppressed for generations and that still exist. And similarly, now, after a comparable time interval, as I said before, just by accident, this will end, I think, for a very surprising, unexpected, unanticipated reason, something occurring that nobody here is thinking about.
I agree with you. In the 1980s, I visited the dissidents in the Soviet Union. And when I came back, I thought, well, those individuals will never be able to change the country. And before the end of the decade, it suddenly happened. It collapsed. And it was impossible to foresee that such a thing would happen. It was invisible, seen with our own Western eyes. And as you said, the Russian dissidents and others were believing in what they were doing and the price of their freedom and their life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. It's been a great pleasure. Victor, it's been a privilege actually to actually hear you.
Great conversation. Thank you for organizing
Your
this.
own words. I've read so many of your opinions over recent years, and I find myself, well, always actually, not generally, but always in agreement with you. And it was this last one that really prompted me to contact you and say, let's get together and have a.
Thank you, and thank you, Willy and Dmytro, for joining us. I enjoyed.
Thank you,
I hope
everybody.
to meet you face to
Thank
face
you,
for a
Gary.
beer when I'm next in Europe.
Thanks.
We look forward to
Thank
that.
you.
We'll hold you to that one.
Okay,
Okay.
very, very good.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.